A warm welcome to everyone to this Agrifose 2030 webinar on the 19th of April 2022. My name is Annelise Sundin. I'm a science communicator in the program. Agrifose 2030 stands for Agriculture for Food Security. And it's a program funded by Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, aiming to help translate and synthesize science into policy and practice. And together with these co-partners, co-hosts, we have this webinar today. So we have L'Université Joseph Kiserbo in Burkina Faso, Stockholm International Water Institute, CV, as well as INERA in Burkina Faso, co-hosting this webinar today. The webinar is called Practical Tools to Evaluate Trade-offs Between Agriculture Productivity and Ecosystem Functions, and it's based on a study that has been undertaken, and you will hear more about this study very soon. I want to make you aware of that we are recording this webinar today for those who couldn't make it, and to be able to promote it further on our websites and so on. If you have any issues, technical issues, we have several technical staff here with us today, so just write in the chat to them and they will help you. And for questions, please save them towards the end of the webinar, where you will be able to post them in the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar. And in the chat, that's where you more informally can chat with your friends and colleagues. I think we can change the slide, please. So here you have the program of today. We will start with looking at why science is important to find tools for these trade-offs. Madeleine Ostwald, who is the challenge leader of one of the challenge areas in Agrifose, will present, and then she will hand over to David Mingason, who's a student at Gothenburg Center for Sustainable Development. He will talk about methods. And then we have our researchers in Burkina Faso, Hugues Bassier and Josiah Sanu, who will talk about results, parts of the results, and then Anna Tengberg from CV will take over and talk further on the results of the study. And then we will hand over to Elizabeth Similton, who's Senior Policy Specialist in Agriculture and Food Security at SIDA, who will bring some of her own reflections and ask some questions to the speakers. And then finally, we will conclude with some questions from the audience, from you. With that said, I will hand over to Madeleine, who will start presenting. I think we can change slide. Perfect.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to present a study that the 5 of us have been working on for about half a year. And we see a picture here, which is actually the final results that Anna will talk about a little bit later. But I can take the next slide so I can give you a little bit of why we did this. So we have identified that there is a problem, and one of the problems are that we need to increase the agricultural productivity on the land that we have, or explore new lands, and that is to feed the population increase that we have, and also the diet changes that are taking place around the world. So there is a need for more food. But there is also another problem, and that is the yield gap. And that means the yield gap is what is potentially to be produced on one piece of land and what is actually being produced. And why there is a yield gap, it links to the different ecosystem functions that exists. And few of the limiting factors that has been identified are such as climate, for example, too hot, too cold, too long growing season, too short growing season, water limitation, and also nutrients in the soil. So all those are ecosystem functions. And when they are depleted or totally being out of function, you create a yield gap, and the land cannot produce the food that it is intended to do. So there is a problem here. I can take the next, please. So what we were talking about, that when a farmer, who is the utmost important person in producing food, when the farmer is standing in front of his growing season, or when he's supposed to plan for his coming growing season, he has to think of, how do I maximize the output of my work and my investments? And how do I do that without juggling with the potential of having a food ecosystem functions services that is needed? And we were talking about this in the group, and we saw that we don't really have that understanding of what kind of practical tools that exists when farmer does this. We know that farmers are extremely adapted to their environment, and they have usually a very strong history on their land that they are using. But how do they actually do this in a practical way? And can we find support of practical tools if we look in science? So that was what we were aiming for in this study. We can take the next, please. So we identified a few aims, and the first one is to look for practical tools to assess trade-offs between agricultural productivity and ecosystem functions. And that is meant to be a tool that can be used by a farmer. So it's not a scientific tool in a way. And we were looking if there is a readiness from science to support that kind of a process or a tool. So the ultimate question we asked was, what practical tools for assessing trade-offs between agricultural productivity and ecosystem functions are available? So that was the aim. And with that, I'd like to hand over to David, that will talk about the actual method that we used.
Right, so now I'm going to introduce you to the methodology we follow to conduct this synthesis work. So once the research question was set, we identified the categories in it to structure the review, and later the search query on the scientific databases. So these categories can be observed in the table on the left. So from left to right, we have ecosystem functions and services, tools, trade-offs, and agriculture. Then for each block, we brainstorm to find synonyms and relevant terms related to the categories, as this will be later used to frame the search query on the various databases. We then created the search query on Scopus database, including all these synonyms. You can see a part of it on the right under the number of results. Building this search query was quite long and a challenging process, as it has to be revised several times since the terms composing it had to be specific enough to obtain a feasible number of results to assess. So to give you an idea, in the first research we did, we obtained over 1 million results. So we narrowed it down, and in the end, we obtained 751 results on Scopus. So next slide, please. To reduce the risk of bias, we decided to use 3 different databases. So in addition to Scopus, we built the same search query on the databases called Biological Abstract and Web of Science, where we obtained 35 and 434 results, respectively. We chose Scopus and Web of Science as they are the main scientific databases, and Biological Abstract because it is one that focuses on agriculture and the environment. We looked in the gray literature, where we collected 79 documents. So in total, we had 1,299 documents to review. They were all first exported to the reference management software called EndNote. We chose EndNote in the beginning because it presents some useful features for synthesis work, such as the deduplication of documents. For the screening process, we carried out 2 screenings and used the software called Ryan. So documents were always divided into 4 distinct groups with 2 viewers per group. So here, for example, on the right, we can see the results of one batch with Josias and Madeline as reviewers. We can observe in green the amount of articles that have been included, and in red those excluded. In black, we can see the article where there was a disagreement. So the 2 reviewers had to discuss to find an agreement on them, whether we include it or not. And then Mendeley, which is another reference management software, was used for providing access to PDFs to everyone's. Next slide, please. So this is a flowchart diagram that summarizes all steps followed. So on top, we can see the number of articles collected according to the 3 databases and the gray literature. And then the total number of articles, the number of papers when duplicates got removed, and the results after the first screening, which was based on title and abstract. So 186 articles were selected out of the 952 and prone to a second screening. This second screening was made on the full text, and while articles were screened, they were also classified into 4 categories. So 1 category for tools, where 39 papers were identified, but only 7 contained relevant practical tools. We also had a category for practices, where we found 37 articles, 1 category for ecosystem functions and services, with 34 documents, and a last category for models with 54 documents. And now I will hand it over to Josias.
Okay, thanks, David. I will talk about the result on ecosystem services and practices and also models. So as David said, after our review, 34 articles were focused on ecosystem services. And after checking these articles, only 32 articles were really dealing with ecosystem services. And in these articles, 12 study was dealing on ecosystem worldwide. And we also see that in these articles, China was and Europe were the area where many articles were dealing with ecosystem services. And several ecosystem services and functions were found in the articles, but many of the articles were dealing with soil conservation and also water yields and quality. Next slide, please. For the practices found in the articles, we found that most articles were dealing also with soil fertility. And in this article, there was interested by all the ecosystem services provisioning, regulating, and supporting ecosystem services. And these soil fertility practices were such as compost and manure application, synthetic fertilizer, biocard applications, and also fallow crops and mulching. And most of the practices were covering all the ecosystem services, provisioning, regulating, supporting. Next slide, please. And for the models, 54 articles were dealing with models. And in this model, there were several types of models, and the higher number of articles on modeling were from China. And as for practices and ecosystem services, soils, the ecosystem related to soils were the most studied by the articles. And also we found that indirect agriculture production were the most area covered by the models. Most of the articles were also GIS articles, modeling, and followed by statistical analysis, and also a model called INVEST, where the most type of models we have in these articles. I will now handle with Anna for the tools.
Thank you, Sayas. And next, please. Yes, I'm going to present results of the analysis of the 39 articles that we categorized as tools for trade-off analysis. And they were in turn subdivided into 4 groups. One dealing with blueprints and protocols using indicators based on principles in ecology and economics, existing models, etc. We had another group dealing with economic assessment of ecosystem services using cost-benefit analysis and or payments for ecosystem services. A third group of articles dealing with decision support and policy tools using rankings, multi-criteria decision analysis, the triple bottom line, etc. And then a group dealing with scenario development, also using existing approaches and a combination of existing maps, models, GIS tools, etc. Next, please. But in the end, we only identified 7 of these tools as practical and ready to use. And you can see them here in the left hand column. And this included the water footprint approach applied here in data scarce regions. And a water footprint of a product is the total volume of fresh water used to produce the product. So you can compare water footprints of different products. We had a healthy farm index developed to assist farmers in managing biodiversity and ecosystem services. There was another tool called Wet Ecoservices tool that provides quick ecosystem service assessment for decision makers, etc., focusing on wetlands and the agriculture that would replace it. There were 2 articles on role-playing games that explore current and alternative policy scenarios. We had 1 tool dealing with resilience and trade-offs, the self-evaluation and holistic assessment of climate resilience of farmers and pastoralists, called SHARP. And then there was TESSA, Toolkit for Ecosystem Services Site-Based Assessment, looking at a site before and after conversion to agriculture, for example. And then finally, there was the ROOM, Restoration Opportunities Assessment Methodology, focusing on assessment opportunities for restoration of forest and mosaic landscapes. And for each tool, we also looked at the ecosystem services targeted, and the environment and land use targeted, and their advantages and disadvantages. Next, please. And based on that analysis, we came up with this figure that synthesizes our findings. So many of the tools focus on just one or a bundle of ecosystem services and are designed for different types of land use and or ecosystems. And they are also applied at different scales. So as I mentioned here, the room tool focuses on forest and mosaic landscapes at quite large scales, while, for example, the Healthy Farm Index at the bottom of the figure focuses on farmland with crops at the plot scale. And there are these two tools, water footprint and wet eco services, focusing more on water-related ecosystem services, water productivity, and wetlands. So tools need to be selected based on the context, priority ecosystem service, and the site characteristics. We also saw that practical and participatory tools, such as the role-playing games, could contribute to negotiations and resolution of conflicts in complex landscapes related to trade-offs that are beyond the scope of more technical and scientific tools that may actually provide a more precise assessment or calculation of a trade-off, but they cannot deal with conflicts. Next, please. So in summary, our findings are that water and soil dominate as topics in this analysis, which is probably not so strange as they are crucial for agriculture and agricultural productivity. And soil fertility improvement, agroforestry, and organic farming are suggested as practices, common practices to deal with trade-offs between productivity and ecosystem services. And the 7 practical tools we analyzed in detail were often produced by development organizations and non-governmental organizations, and they focused on specific landscapes. And I think there is a scope for testing them also in other contexts and develop them further. So in conclusion, science is good, but too complex for being practical in this case. So brokers are needed to make trade-off analysis and the tools accessible to practitioners. And the brokers in this case seem to be development organizations and NGOs. So collaboration between science, development, and practitioners is very much needed to move forward with trade-off analysis related to agriculture. So I stop there and I hand over to Anneli again.
Thank you so much. Now it's time for some reflections and some discussions with all the speakers. So Anna, Josias, David, Hugues, and Madeleine. And this will be led by Elizabeth Similton at SIDA. So with that, I hand over to you, Elizabeth. And before I do that, I can also just remind everyone that you can post questions already now in the Q&A, and we will take them later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, lovely. It's great to see you. And thank you so much for this lovely presentation and for allowing me to share some reflections on really important and interesting study. I think you made a really clear presentation. I like the way you have sort of put the tools, the few ones that you found on this landscape, because I think that's where we need to look and how we can make them more coherent and use these piece them together. So I think you demonstrated the gaps, not perhaps the knowledge gaps, because we have quite a lot of knowledge, but actually where the communication gaps are, and there are gaps in the ability for scientists to transfer and translate scientific knowledge into practice. So yeah, I think your study shows that we have very few models that can do that, that can support decision-making processes that are inclusive and that also can assess consequences or trade-offs and balance these decisions on the sustainability of natural resources or ecosystem services, I would say. So it makes me reflect a lot about my previous job when I worked with ICRAF. As a scientist, I recognize well this absence of models that we can use to talk with farmers and also to talk with decision makers at the local levels, and perhaps even simulate the consequences of decisions. And more importantly, also to communicate our understanding, our mental pictures that we have. So I think it's reflecting of the times we're living. My personal feeling is that in the 21st century, our worldviews are more scattered than ever. For example, we need to speed up now the process of reaching the sustainability goals or sustainable development goals. We have set up the Agenda 2030 targets, and we have 6 harvests left to go there. But in the UN, even, the climate change, soil degradation, biodiversity loss are still treated in separate conventions. And we cannot even model and see how these 3 simple natural processes interact. So I think that's, it's telling, it's a lot of telling here. So despite the knowledge that we have, we don't have these tools that are actionable really to demonstrate and to take consequences. I think for the yield gap, if we just go back to the yield gap, what I find really interesting with this review is that it's also pointing out that it's not only an agronomic gap. It's not just to provide high yielding seeds, more fertilizers, pest and disease control, irrigation, and then we have solved the problems. It's bigger than that. And I think perhaps in the past, and maybe still in our thinking, we still compare against the wrong baseline. Because we say conventional farming, which means fossil fuel intensive or monoculture practices with inorganic inputs. And these conventional yield gaps also don't include the environmental transaction costs. So I think the review has shown that most yield gap studies that you had reviewed were actually concerned with provisional ecosystem services, which I consider quantitative, let's say, and then rather than the qualifiers, which would be the supporting and the regulating ecosystem services that can narrow the yield gap, and not the least, the cultural ecosystem services. And so if we don't balance all these inputs, the trade-off analysis will also be very unbalanced from the start. And if I understood correctly, there was just one of the models that was considering cultural ecosystem services. So this is sort of forgetting who is doing the farming. The farmer is already not in there in these models. You can comment on that later. I would just go. I just wanted to sort of go over to a few questions rather than me talking. I was just sharing some of my thoughts. But I think you have really demonstrated the problems, and I think we agree on the problems are. So I want to go more on to what's the best way moving away from here. You've stated that there are some limits for uptake. And in my experience, I think we can call it time and money equals interest. So there is a gap here between the developers of the tools and the users of the tools. And you talk about the brokers as development NGOs who can communicate here. And so I have 3 questions to sort of start this thing going. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can make these tools more useful. So as a norm, even not just to use by farmers, but also by government officers and local NGOs, when there are such limited budgets, both for government offices and NGOs. So the projects they have, the projects that we used to work in projects. again, scattering up our lives. So how can they, when they are limited in spatial and temporal scales, how can we then make sure that these tools become inclusive, that as they are intended to be inclusive? We would need another phase of a project before the product itself starts. If they are inclusive, we also need to have a question about whether the solutions, what we are trading off, let's say, how can we know that before the project has started? Because then that sort of sets the frame of the project. So is that possible to think of even having simple tools that we can use before a project is funded to just really understand what the trade-offs are and what the issues are that we're trying to solve with the project? And then maybe I'll skip one question. I'll just go on to the second one. So in the first screening phases in the methods, in the review, you present a lot of papers with lots of models, but then most of them are excluded. And so is there a tendency that you see around scientists to get funded to go and develop more tools? We have a lot of tools in the beginning, but in the end, there are only a few of them left. So is there a tendency that you see that we sort of get funded to develop new and more models rather than forgetting about the uptake or the use of these models? So this is reflected in the sort of funnel that you have in the review, that there are so few tools left. So could you say something perhaps also about the uptake of these models that you have screened and that you have reviewed? Is the scientific community really interested in evaluating the models that they develop? And are donors interested in those evaluations as well, is the question. So are there lots of tools out there, and then we just go on and develop more tools rather than working and improving the ones we have? I think I will stop there and just let the people who know what to talk about speak.
All right. Should I would just like to, if I may start. I think Josias and Ygg has a very interesting story to tell with regards to the at least ideas around how this could be long-term and sustainable, even when a project is ending, because they have thought a lot about that. And maybe Josias and Ygg, maybe you can just tell a little bit about your work. About the innovative platform work that you're working on and the reason you're thinking about how to make it last after you kind of have left.
Yeah, in the framework of our project, we built some organization called Innovative Platform, where farmers, extensionists from different ministry, local decision makers like municipalities and traditional chiefs try to discuss and find solution for how to manage parkland for better food production and healthy environmental issues. So we find that, we think that this kind of tools can help them to achieve this, what we want to do. And for what to do to make this long-term activity, maybe we can try to find more simple tools that will help them to analyze and find solution for parkland management. I don't know if there's something to add.
And also for this innovative platform, we have a different region, because in each region it's not the same context. With climatic, with soil erosion, the context is more different for the different locality, and farmer try to transfer the tool that is okay in this region. It's possible to use this in another region, and farmer with extension discuss every time for each problem that we find in the farm, and try to have a good solution, because the traditional chief have the rule on the farmer, on farm management. Also, a government have a tool, a law for the farm management. And when the different farmer extension service, NGO work together, discuss, they can use the same thing for the better land management for sustainability. Thank you.
And I know that I just want to add, you and Josias are thinking about how this could last beyond 2 years, when they are putting a lot of thoughts and a lot of work into this. So, and they have been thinking about how they could make it profitable, so that these organizations can kind of make it worthwhile continuing even after they have left. But that, I think that's the $10,000 question. I mean, how to make this work. But I mean, they are doing a very interesting job in Burkina Faso on the parklands.
Yeah, we think that till the end of the project, we'll try to organize them to a more formal, kind of organization that will be focused on organic management of the parklands, and try to find the way to help them to have self-financial potential in doing some kind of activity that will bring them some revenue to finance themselves, their activities.
Anna, you were thinking of something.
Yes, I wanted to answer some questions here. Elizabeth asked about the use of these tools and who is using them, etc., and how to make them more inclusive. I think that many of these practical tools developed by development agencies and NGOs, they are in fact used at the beginning of a project or at the project design phase to get an overall view of different trade-offs, let's say, in an agricultural landscape. And often they show kind of the trend. But I think there is scope also for combining these more inclusive participatory tools with more scientific tools and models once a project has started, to do a more thorough assessment and to also validate them. And so it goes both ways. It's also development practitioners that need to involve scientists, not only scientists that need to kind of approach development. So I see scope for combining these tools. Many sophisticated models are only used in research context. I think they could be used also in development. Many have been, are quite kind of ready to use. It's just that they are complicated. So development practitioners cannot use them. But by bringing scientists and practitioners together, we can get an overall better assessment.
Yeah, that's my experience too, is that we use so complicated models that they also sort of narrow down the topics that are maybe not relevant for farmers, for example, and to include their questions. Something I was thinking about is also the value of land, which depends a lot on what happens outside the field. And maybe these are landscape-based models, but I'm thinking too that the if the value of land increases, then it will be more some people on the outside of those fields will be more interested for land concession or land acquisition. Or conversely, if the land is so bad that it cannot produce what farmers want, then farmers may also be likely to give it up for something else if they cannot grow enough food even for themselves or for what they need for the household. So there are so many factors and variables that are really difficult to consider. Maybe take them in sequences. I don't know. So many questions we cannot even project.
And one more comment, you mentioned value of land, and you earlier mentioned cultural ecosystem services. There, I think in a couple of models, land tenure was used as an indicator that I think is very important, actually. So it's included more in these, practical tools, not in the quantitative models, because then it's difficult to include a thing like land tenure.
Do you think the tools would be also helpful then to talk about different scenarios rather than having one? If you have scenarios, you can talk about what could happen if we do this or that, and then it doesn't mean that is it easier then? Do you find that it's easier then to talk about sensitive topics like land grabbing or whatever, like the neighbors use or neighbors cattle that will walk into your fields, and maybe there are conflicts in about land tenure issues and land use. Do you have experience of using these tools sort of to talk about such sensitive issues?
I think we saw in some articles, those focusing on role-playing games, that kind of issues were addressed, but in a more kind of playful way, also looking at different scenarios when you play the game. So I think there is a scope to develop that type of tools to solve conflicts in the landscape before they occur.
So I think that's one of the conclusions that we've been discussing quite a lot, is that when it comes to these 7, it could be very interesting to test them out in different contexts to see how they play out. And we've been talking about, since Ygen Josias is working on this and they already have a kind of an organization set up, it could be interesting to test it where they are working, just to see how it works and what is necessary and missing, maybe also. But that's just a future idea. We haven't done it yet.
I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
When there were crop models, there were lots of crop model comparisons, I think in the 90s and 2000s. And I'm wondering maybe that actually helped to improve the standards of these crop models, and you knew what was going in and out and you could compare them. And I'm wondering if that's something, of course the variables are different here, but maybe that's something to have into comparison of different tools.
Yeah, and that is also one thing that we have been discussing in the group, is that we have now studied, 186 articles, and a lot of them are models that are too complex for us to even comprehend in full. So, but we think that it's, in the same time, the science is actually pushing things forward, but it's just that it's done in a separate lane compared to where it happens in practice. But so one of the suggestions, like Anna proposed in her last slide, is try to promote collaboration between the science, the practitioners, and those brokers. Could be very, very worthwhile to improve these practical tools and even the models. It goes both ways, I guess. So, but I don't think we should say that the practitioners are at fault for not asking the science the right thing. And I don't think we should blame the scientist for not doing the right thing, because, we have our own deeds, but we need these brokers. We really think that the broker, and that's a little bit the whole thing with Agrifose, is to translate science into policy and practice. So, it's definitely a gap and a need there.
And perhaps this platform that Josias was talking about could be the platform also where you can have inter-comparisons and people could post maybe their results of these tools and their experiences.
Yeah.
Well,
if I can jump in, Elizabeth, maybe you can wrap up if you have some final reflections or questions, and then we'll move over to the Q&A.
Go for the Q&A.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing, Anneli?
Yes.
Maybe we could
absolutely.
put in a chat or somewhere, we can put some link to Agrifose, because there are a lot of these things that Ygin Josiah has done in Burkina is available there. So maybe if people are interested in looking at the innovative platform.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll ask the technical staff to post some links. And perhaps I realize, Elizabeth, you might leave from the spotlight, but maybe we can keep you on the spotlight because there might be questions you can help answer as well. I just realized that now. So let's move over to the Q&A. There are a few people, or there's one person who have asked quite a few questions. I don't know, Madeleine, have you managed to have a look at them? There's a lot of interesting questions. And shall I start with the first one?
Yes, please do, because I can't really see the questions.
Oh, you can't?
No.
Okay. Oh,
but
okay.
Go ahead, shoot.
Well, there's a attendee called Jason Pinza who has asked many questions. Thank you for your engagement. He's asking, in categorizing papers based on ESS, what is the difference between the categories of water versus hydrology? So water in terms of quality and yield versus hydrology, groundwater. I don't know if anyone can answer this.
I can take a shot first. When we first did the categorizations, we had 60, 70, 80 different categories because we kind of divided them all into different things. So hydrology was definitely a separate one. And then we had water quality as one, and we had all kinds of different things. But in the end, we decided that we lumped them a little bit together. So in the water category, it's water yield, water quality, water access, hydrology, groundwater. A lot of things can be included there.
Okay, good, cool. That's he's also wondering if there were tools ready to use that are related to nature-based solutions to improve water availability.
Maybe I will try.
Yes, go ahead, Anna.
There were two tools more focused on water, water footprint, focusing on water productivity and wet ecoservices, looking at wetlands and what will happen, to the hydrological services if they are replaced by agriculture. So I guess they could be considered as useful in that context. But I also think the resilience tool, SHARP, it includes a lot of questionnaires, on all kinds of ecosystem services. So I think that could also be used to look at the possibility of nature-based solutions.
Thank you. I hope that answered the question. We have another question, which is also a little bit directed to SIDA, from Linnea Lundeborg, who's asking, it's quite long, so I'll read it out. Many smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the global south are dependent upon expensive hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers bought from multinational seed companies, which decrease their soil quality and biodiversity. Research are increasingly focusing on traditional crops such as small grains and organic fertilizers to increase the food security in their livelihood and the soils. What are the biggest challenges to enable farmers to become more food sovereign? And in what way are SIDA and other organizations working with these issues, and how can this work be improved? Thank you. From a Lund University student. Does anyone feel challenged to take this on?
Wasn't this addressed to SIDA?
Well, other organizations such as Agrifose, perhaps.
Yeah.
As well.
Do you want to start, Elizabeth?
Well, actually, we're going through the projects that we were funding last year. So we will soon come up with a description of the different interventions that we are doing at SIDA, particularly in the African continent. I think looking at sustainability and supporting people to take long-term decisions is what SIDA really wants to promote. And so that was the SIDA hat. On the other hat, I also want to mention my former hat, which was ICRAF. There is a really, really interesting project with refugees and refugee camps, and perhaps Josiah knows more about it, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, where in refugee camps they are doing agroforestry as a solution for keeping energy. So food sovereignty, maybe not so much, but at least they can provide themselves with food and energy. That's the idea. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look more into, people who live in conflict areas and people who are displaced, how they can also take over their own control over food.
Mm. Thank you, Elizabeth. Does anyone else want to add anything here?
I was just thinking about Josiah Zanig, in your agroecology project, you are actually trying to highlight the issue of different kinds of management practices with less conventional methods.
And less conventional fertilizers, right?
Yeah. So there will be results from their project coming soon.
Yeah.
Be of interest.
To know if Josiah or Ig want to add something, but we will definitely be keeping you posted about this project later on.
Maybe you can just say the different methods that you will have as showcases this growing season coming up this summer.
Yeah, exactly, as demonstrations.
Yeah.
Yeah, in our project we try to move from the conventional agriculture to more organic agriculture. And what we are doing is try to sensitize farmers, stakeholders, local decision makers on what is the ill-fee issue of conventional agriculture. And if they know what are these issues, they will try to move from this conventional agriculture to more organic. And in our country, the conventional agriculture become more expensive because of the inorganic fertilizer, which are imports. And as you know, this last year, due to the COVID context and also, this fertilizer are becoming more very expensive. So we try to find alternative with organic fertilizers.
Interesting. Elizabeth?
Can I just add, do you see now that fertilizers are becoming so important, expensive, that there actually is a demand for more circular agriculture? Do you see that happening already, or is it too soon already?
I didn't have your question.
So now that fertilizers are becoming more expensive, do you already now see that there is a demand for more circular agricultural practices, like making your own fertilizer, your own compost, and reducing the inputs of chemicals? Do you see that happening already?
Yeah, that is happening this last year, because I know that in Ouagadougou there are some small companies are producing organic fertilizers. They start investing it.
A new business.
Yeah.
We're approaching the end of the webinar, but since we were a bit delayed, I will continue for 1 or 2 more minutes. And if people have to leave, they have to leave. There's one question here related to, let me see, to citizen science. Jason is asking if you can comment on the tools being able to promote citizen science, i.e. smooth collaboration with scientists and other stakeholders.
Okay, maybe I can comment on that.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that several of the practical tools are very suitable for citizen science involving farmers themselves. The more participatory qualitative tools, I think Tessa, I even think a Sharp tool, yeah, the land users themselves can get involved.
Okay, thank you. I also have one more question. Can I take it, you think?
Shoot.
I should. I mean, since this is a synthesis study that you've been doing, as part of the Agrifose program, we have these courses to train researchers in becoming better at both synthesizing science, but also communicating science. And I know that you, the team here, you have all taken the course we have on systematic reviews. What do you think is the power of doing these types of studies, synthesis studies and systematic reviews and maps?
Do you want to go, Josias? What do you think is the power?
The power of this kind of study is that going through many articles, you will find many knowledge, and trying to synthesize this knowledge help you to have a more focus on what we are searching for.
On the solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe David has something to say about the search, as he was very much one driving that.
Yes, I would say that this type of synthesis work is very useful to collate, describe, and catalog available evidence related to a specific topic. And it is very helpful to synthesize, because we can gather a lot of papers through different databases. So in the end we can really summarize and summarize like all the knowledge available.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we will wrap the seminar, the webinar up there. And with that, I would like to thank all the speakers and wish you luck on the next step and with this study. Elizabeth Simonton had to leave, but thanks so much to her for the facilitation of the discussions and reflections. And then thanks to all the technical staff involved in this webinar. Again, sorry that we had some issues with making sure that the Zoom links are working. We will be sharing the webinar on our website, so please and send you a link as well. Also, thank you, the audience, for joining and for posing questions, etc. We do plan for other webinars in the Agrifose 2030 program. Keep yourself updated through our website, but also you can sign up to our newsletter to make sure you don't miss anything. With that said, I thank you everyone and have a nice continuation of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.